Hello, I'm live today, Thursday. November 29th. So I was thinking about jumping on live tomorrow, which is Friday, because I had a big space of time. I wanted to advertise that I was going to be on live so people could send me questions or just know that I'd be here. And then I decided not to because a couple of things happened today, which got my brain thinking and was like, man, I keep talking about wanting to share this certain thing and I don't. And I think I'm going to write a blog post and then I don't. And I'm waiting for this perfect opportunity to collect my thoughts, because I have a habit of online maybe worrying that I might ruffle some feathers. And as a people pleaser, that can make me feel uncomfortable. The funny thing is when I teach workshops, I almost always start the workshop off of, after I introduce myself and talk about, the topic for the day, I kind of give a disclaimer that I probably will challenge some deeply held beliefs that you have about the body, and which may or may not offend you. I say this out of experience. When I was going through some education in the past, one of the instructors said something, and it was like a quote, and it was, well, I'll tell you the quote was. It was the quote that I often tell people. And this is sometimes in it's a game of telephone that's been translated from a foreign language, possibly, or at least in someone's brain, translated from their primary language, which was not English. And in the class, when the teacher said that Jean-Pierre Barral, the Barral Institute, he had this saying that the muscles are the garbage can of the body. And he said it, and I was laughing, and then we continued on with what we were doing, which was learning visceral manipulation of something in the abdomen at the time, right? Because it was one of the first classes I took. And I didn't really realize it at the time. It wasn't until a few days, maybe even weeks later, that I was like, holy shit, that comment really offended me. And it offended me because I was like, wait a second, what do you mean the muscles are the garbage can of the body? My work, my life, my career has been built around the muscles in one form or another, right? I am an athletic trainer. I work with athletes. I worked at a performance training facility. We're all about muscles, right? And prior to the visceral manipulation, my education, my continuing education in the world was, after my schooling, was Sarman's movement impairment systems, which is all about muscles, movement function, the belief that our movement dysfunctions leads to injuries, and that means that there's a certain muscle that needs to do certain jobs, and blah blah blah, right? So it was really a while after the class that they said that quote from Jean-Pierre that I realized how offended I was. And that's when I realized I was offended because it was a challenge to a really deep belief I had about how the body worked. And how wonderful that I realized that. And I took that challenge to my beliefs, and I was like, okay, well, I'm still going to believe what I'm going to believe, but I'm going to try out their way, and I'm going to see if I can see his perspective. And maybe that perspective makes more sense, and maybe it's a missing piece, and maybe I just approach everything with the curiosity of the stories I tell my athletes about their body and about why something works or doesn't work. Is it really true? Like an exercise. Is an exercise doing what I really think it's doing? Or is it doing it via a different mechanism, right? And so it doesn't mean it's a bad exercise. It means that maybe in the past I used it in my programming for one reason. And then now, as I've learned more, I put it in my programming for a different reason. So anyways, that's what I mean. That's why I gave the warning of like this live today may offend you, and it's also why I wanted to jump on live without warning, is because today it's like fully in my thoughts, and it's like I should just fucking share it because I don't care if I offend anybody, because in fact, I want to offend you because I feel like I did my job better if I get you to challenge some deeply held beliefs you have about the body. So there's my disclaimer. And hip flexor stretches. That's what I'm going to talk about. This whole Facebook Live is I want to talk about hip flexor stretches. The reason why I want to talk about hip flexor stretches is because across the board, they're like the one thing that I see every level of person in movement do, right? Whether it's a athletic trainer and a physical therapist doing rehab stuff, or it's a yoga teacher, or it's a Pilates teacher, or it's a personal trainer or a strength coach. If it's a class or an individual setting, sometime I have been the student of or been observing someone instruct a hip flexor stretch. And it's one that I kind of cringe upon. And full disclaiming, this was me. Like back before I had all the education I have now and my beliefs and philosophies I have about how the body works now, I would teach the hip flexor stretch in the same exact way. So I'm not saying that, oh, everyone should know better. I want to just offer what my curiosity has led me to believe about the hip and pelvis complex, and maybe challenge your beliefs and challenge the way you cue a hip flexor release or a hip flexor stretch, and question maybe if you need to do it in isolation. So in Soul Cycle today, actually, it came up, and I was like, you know what, I'm done. I can't listen to any more people cue hip flexor stretches without like telling the world my thoughts, besides the people in my classes that have probably heard this from me already. So I dislike hip flexor stretches for a lot of reasons. One reason is it's still a very reductionist, isolated approach to the body, assuming that the hip flexor is a tight muscle that needs to be short and needs to be longer or more flexible, and that you can do that with a simple linear stretch. So I don't believe that the body has anything in isolation. When you look at the anatomy, it doesn't support that. So that's why I don't like, it's rare that you're going to see me teach my athlete or in my own body do an isolated hip flexor stretch. The linear thing is a big thing because if you look at the anatomy, the shape of the muscles, both hip flexors, the psoas and the iliacus, are cone or cylinder shaped and have a twist in them. And so the thought that a linear movement is going to adequately stretch them out, I think is ridiculous. So there's that. And also, probably like the thing that makes me cringe the most is the cue to tuck the pelvis under or squeeze the glutes and really squeeze the glutes and push your pelvis forward and tuck your tail under. So that goes back to the fundamentals of understanding what you're doing. The reason why people give that cue is because of the glutes are the opposite muscle to the hip flexor. So it comes out of like a contract, relax, or hold, relax, PNF type thought process of stretching a muscle, right? That if you activate the agonist or antagonist, that the agonist relaxes. So that's a reason why I don't like it. That goes back to the isolation thing. I don't believe that there's such thing as agonists, antagonists, and synergists. I am a biotensegrity approach, that the muscles all have a certain level of tension appropriate to keep the structure supported through the fascial web. So there's the number one thing is I don't believe in an antagonist and agonist relationship. So, however, though, that's where that cue comes from, is the thought process that if you squeeze your glute, the hip flexor relaxes and you can get more length out of it, or actually deform the connective tissue and make a change in the length. So, I disagree. Also, the fact that the squeezing the glute ends up having a posterior tilt of the pelvis. That is incorrect. If you are posterior tilting the pelvis, or that's your cue, tuck your butt under, that's posterior pelvic floor, and that's hamstrings, okay? And most people, because it's a primitive reflex of stress, are already in a posterior tilted position and have a lot of tension in their muscles because they're stressed out. And so I want wide sits bones. I want a normal orientation of the pelvis, which is neutral, which is close to 15 degrees of anterior tilt. Now, the premise also when you're stretching muscles is that you're lengthening it, right? Like, I'm pretty sure this is how a stretch works. That if I want to stretch my quad, I take it from the shortened position of knee extension to the lengthened position of knee flexion, or my bicep, right? That's an easy one to think about. A shortened position of the bicep is a curl. A lengthened position is a straight arm. And so if I'm stretching my bicep, I'm probably straightening my arm. So if we're taking that premise, if we want to lengthen the muscle, tucking the pelvis under is actually not doing that. Not doing that at all. Especially when you look at the psoas. The only thing that tucking the pelvis is doing is possibly translating the head of the femur more, well, forward in a sense, because it's taking the other side of the joint and it's going into sort of a hyperextension of the joint and irritating the front of the anterior hip capsule and overstretching the nerves from there. So, because we do know that the nerves will start to lengthen or go in a more elongated position when we're in a flexed spine, or which includes the pelvis. So, oftentimes the sensation people get across the front of their hip is a neural sensation that most people feel is a stretch or tightness. Like, that's just the way our brain works sometimes. So, if we were actually lengthening the hip flexor, moving into hip extension, the knee moves back in hip extension, and the pelvis moves into anterior tilt, right? This is a running mechanic, right? As one leg goes up into flexion, the pelvis actually posteriorly tilts, the other leg anteriorly tilts. You get a winding up of the pelvis. This is why the pelvis is three separate, like the whole pelvic complex is three separate bones. If it was not made to have that counteractive rotation, then it would not move like that. So if you're going to the premise of stretching your hip flexor, it should actually be with an anterior tilt of the pelvis, a knee extension, and then talking about the spine, like what's going on with the spine. In order to lengthen that end of the psoas, you would be going into side bending, right? So, or you could argue that flexion of the thoracolumbar area would be lengthening it on the other end. So thoracolumbar flexion is not the same thing as tucking your butt under. Not the same thing at all. I would actually lengthen that portion of the psoas by doing a three-dimensional breathing of the diaphragm, because the psoas ends up being an eccentrically lengthens as the diaphragm drops down. The diaphragm drops down, it pulls on the lumbar spine a little bit. You can add in a little flexion right at that TL junction. Now we're bringing the psoas away from the leg. So that's another reason, the whole pelvis thing. I promise you that most of your people do not have anterior tilted pelvis. Even if they have the scissors posture, I promise you it's rarely from the pelvis itself. So how you check this, in fact, I was doing this with a friend of mine who's a coach the other day. He asked me to evaluate him. And I was like, well, listen, your pelvis is tucked up underneath you. And he's like, no, it's not. I was like, yes, it is. And I pointed out, I put my hands on the front of his pelvis, on his ASIS, the point of his hip, and then I found his PSIS. And his PSIS and his ASIS were level, if not a little higher ASIS than PSIS. That is posteriorly tilted. A neutral pelvis is like 12.8 degrees of anterior tilt, which is going to be front of the body, ASIS, lower than back of the body, PSIS. Okay? So until you actually put your hands on someone's pelvis, if you've not trained your eye to see it, you don't really know if their pelvis is posteriorly rotated or anteriorly rotated. You cannot assume because they have the scissors look that it's coming from their pelvis. The majority of the time it's coming from their rib cage in their thoracolumbar junction. Okay. So the other thing that I don't like about the hip flexor stretch is most of the time it's in a kneeling position. And in a kneeling position, a lot of times people don't have the hip flexion on the opposite leg to be in a kneeling position and clear the, and keep their spine from side bending, their pelvis from side bending. So most of the time, if I am letting people do a hip flexor stretch, I am bringing the floor up higher than their foot, so the knee up higher than their foot with a pad or a block or something, so that their pelvis can be relatively neutral and not side bent. Because if you're side bent, you're throwing off the mechanics, and you're actually then, it's like bringing the leg into abduction. So you're not going to, so you're not starting in a neutral position, right? Yeah. So that's another reason why I don't like the hip flexor, the kneeling hip flexor stretch. I'm looking, I took some notes down because I know I get like super fired up about this, and I wanted to make sure that I kept my thoughts. So the biggest thing is the sensation piece. People are like, oh, but when I tuck my butt under, I really get that sensation. And like I talked about before, I don't think it's an actual stretch of the muscle. If you have stretched anything that is tight, a muscle that is actually tight, it is not a feel-good stretch. Like it doesn't feel like it's a different sensation that you're getting with a nerve stretch. And so it's important to realize the difference. And oftentimes, to convince people of this, I will play around with their head position so they can see. If you set up in a half kneeling position and you tuck your butt under like traditionally told, squeeze the glute and like think about pressing things forward and feel that sensation. If you drop your head down like chin tuck and chin nod, coming into some more flexion, if it increases it, it's a nerve stretch. Or here's the opposite. Lift your chin up, coming into cervical extension. Does it decrease that sensation? Probably. It's a nerve stretch. What do the nerves hate? A sustained elongation, which after taking Michael Shackleck's class, he was basically like, you should never have that sensation on the nerve for more than 15 seconds. That deforms things. That changes the viscoelastic properties around the nerve, the intraneural pressure, and can damage the nerve, right? So you don't want that. And most of the time people will say, well, you need to hold the hip flexor stretch for 20 seconds or 30 seconds or do like 6 seconds reps repeatedly, right? And so it's like, you don't want to do that to the nerves. And so it's really important to know, like, is the hip flexor stretch you're doing really doing what you're doing? So the other thing is that it's kind of, again, isolative in a kind of a lazy way where we're only focused on the sensations and what's happening across the front of our hip joint. And we're not maintaining a good dynamic alignment and fascial tensegrity of our entire system. You can easily change this by having active dorsiflexion of both the back foot and the front foot. So the front foot being in a closed chain dorsiflexion, foot on the floor, just having a little bit of activation through there. The yogis know that as padabandha, right? Like the engagement of the intrinsic muscles of the foot, which translates up the chain. And then the back foot needs to be in dorsiflexion and toe extension. So we are on the weight-bearing surface of our foot, which is the long bones of the metatarsal heads in that position of dorsiflexion. When we are in those active dorsiflex position, our fascial tensegrity has really good capacity to maintain our shape and actually be very decompressive to all of our joints. And then you're more likely to move better as you're moving into all the variations to change the focus of the stretch on the on the TFL or the iliacus or the psoas or whatever you're trying to do, or maybe you're trying to get sartorius or rectus femoris. So that's another important part as well. If you ever have the opportunity to learn with me, whether it's going to be next year when I launch the online mentorship program or just in a live workshop, we can detail out how to isolate each one of those muscles, like what you would do for it and what the cone shape of the muscle, the cylindrical shape of the muscle, how that changes your approach on stretching if you are a person who wants to stretch. So a lot of times the next questions I get from people is, then what do I do for hip flexor mobility? I'm a big fan of using a soft ball to do a release on it, and I use the quotes around the release because it's one of those things that I don't think it's doing what we think it's doing. I think it is actually having more of effect on the viscera and therefore improving sensation and information into our brain and decreasing our stress state, right? Taking us out of threat, and therefore our muscles relax. It is also increasing awareness or proprioception in the area of that muscle and of those joints, and so we tend to then move better as well. So I don't think sometimes that the releases I do with self-massage tools are actually doing massage or changing the tissue physiology in that sense. But then also I feel like if you're moving well and if you're teaching movement well, then there's no need to isolate things to get more mobility out of them because it just happens naturally. So some of the things that I do to maybe address it would be rolling. So the Da Vinci rolling is probably my go-to if I'm trying to integrate somebody's dynamic alignment of the trunk and rib cage, as well as maximize their mobility and the movement, the oppositional movement across their pelvic complex, right? And so that to me is more important than the mobility of their hip flexor. Is, can one side go into posterior tilt as the other side goes into anterior tilt, and can it switch it? Because that's going to equate more to locomotion than anything else. So those are that's my soapbox for today. I don't need to go in too much detail. I just wanted you guys to hear my thoughts and maybe open an anatomy book, look at the muscles a little bit more, look at the joints, and think about how things move around there, and approach your next session with your clients, whether it's in a group class or one-on-one, with a little bit different curiosity about maybe not having so much belief in squeezing the glutes, tucking the tail, or even stretching the hip flexor in isolation to begin with. So that's it. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're enjoying me jumping on live more often. And like I said, sorry this one was not scheduled, but I think it's better that way sometimes, because when I get fired up about something, I just want to freaking share it. And this is a great platform to share it. So if you don't know already, if you didn't notice, I've been taking the audio from all of these lives and I've been putting them on my SoundCloud account, so you can listen to them or share them, or tell your friends to listen to them from an audio standpoint. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't have time to be watching videos all the time, and it's way easier to listen to things like a podcast style sometimes in a busy day than it is to watch. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for joining me, everybody. It's nice to see you, and let me know if there's other topics that you want me to chat about in the future. Have a great day. Love ya. Bye.